Well, good evening and welcome to our seminar this evening. You're very welcome wherever you are in the world. We look forward to um, you taking part in our Q&A afterwards. It's my pleasure. I'm Paul Ure. I'm an ex-professor of physics here at Oxford University. We're actually met our speaker tonight, Dr. Bethany Sollereder. Dr. Sollereder is a lecturer in science and religion at the School of Divinity in the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. She received her PhD in theology from the University of Exeter and an MCS in interdisciplinary studies from Regent College, Vancouver. She specialises in theology concerning evolution and the problem of suffering. Her current work is about the theological possibilities and human vocation in the light of irreversible changes in ecological degradation. She's also interested in the intersection between psychology and faith, particularly how different approaches to theology can affect people's experiences of suffering. And this interest led to the publication of her book, Why Is There Suffering? Pick Your Own Theological Adventure, published by Zondervan in 2021. And this was the first Pick Your Own Ending theology book. Dr. Sollereder is working currently on a wider research program in what she has called compassionate theodicy. She's recently co-edited the volume Progress in Theology, Does the Queen of the Sciences Advance? And I think that's published by Routledge next year, 2025. So without further ado, we look forward to hearing Dr. Sollereder on this fascinating subject tonight, one of the most difficult ones that we face in the area of faith in God and how to understand some of these difficult problems. So I'll hand over to Bethany now, and we look forward to hearing from her.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate that. I'm just going to get my slides going here, and hopefully that has appeared for everyone now. Well, it really is a pleasure to be able to talk with you tonight. As Paul described my research, I thought how much it sounds like I'm madly off in all directions. And in a sense, that is right. I love exploring the world. But this topic that we're doing tonight is really the heart of a lot of my research and the foundation of everything else I've gone on to do. Nowadays, we hear a lot about environmental issues, and of course, we hear about animal treatment as it works through our agricultural systems, as part of our food systems. And those are really important, pressing issues. But today, I want to take a step back from those pressing, sort of human centered issues and look at the theology of animals themselves. And so the way I'm going to do that is by bracketing human treatment of animals out of the questions we're asking. And so we're going to largely look at animals as they existed before humans were around, before they had evolved. And that gives us a different sort of theological perspective on the question. Now, since the time that the long history of evolution was recognized, and particularly the method of evolutionary development through natural selection, there have been theological questions raised, because the truth is, animal living in nature can be pretty grim. And so you have someone like Darwin who says, I simply cannot believe, I cannot persuade myself that a benevolent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae wasp with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. And he went on in another letter to a friend to say, what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering low, and horridly cruel works of nature. And so today what I'm going to do is try and provide a whole spectrum of responses of how theologians have approached this question of animal suffering long before humans were around to cause it. Now, there are three major camps, and the first sort of camp is simply what I'll call denial. So you could first of all deny that God exists, in which case the universe has precisely the properties we might expect, and animal suffering is neither here nor there. It's not meaningful in any way, apart from as part of an evolutionary process where suffering is something that has developed to protect the organisms that do suffer. And so there's no questions of justice or mercy or wider meaning in their suffering. It's just another survival technique. A second way to get around the problem is to deny that evolution happened. And we see that in some young Earth creationists who will say, well, actually, evolution has not happened. God created everything in its present form some 6,000 years ago. And so there was no suffering that happened before humans were around to cause their suffering. And then finally, you could simply say that animals don't suffer in any morally important way. And you see this with somebody like C.S. Lewis offers this possibility in his book on the problem of pain. And you see it in philosophers like Michael Murray, who offers a sort of neo-Cartesian approach. What he would say that, well, animals certainly do feel pain, and some of that pain is processed consciously, that the self-consciousness required to feel pain really is not the type that is morally important, except when you get to the consciousness level of humans. And so in that case, then you start having this problem of significant moral pain. But before that, animals are simply reacting to stress and living in relationship to their world, but their suffering is not something we should be theologically or philosophically concerned with. So I'm not going to spend much time on these. Obviously, this is an interfaith forum where most present will hold some sort of view of God. I also will not accept that there was no evolution at all, because I think that rejects too much of what science can tell us about the world, which I think is reliable information. And when it comes to no animal suffering, I think that's the most interesting thing. And I do think that there actually is something to that. So insofar as Darwin was worried about these caterpillars who have this wasp that lay their eggs and the larvae, eat their way out from the inside, it's probable that the caterpillar is not feeling anything like suffering in the way that you and I would think about it. But when it gets to more complex animals, when it gets to birds, when it gets to fish, and when it particularly gets to mammals, it seems pretty hard to deny that something like suffering is going on, because they have the same behavioral responses, the same chemical responses. It's being prompted in the same parts of the brain. They have long-term behavioral change that's very much like humans who've gone through trauma. And even, the research that we do on animal pain to find new ways to help human pain suggests that we do think that it's largely similar. And so in the Calgary Zoo in Alberta, in Canada, they found that polar bears who were exhibiting sort of anxious stress symptoms were given Xanax, and it helped. They stopped pacing, they stopped scratching themselves, they stopped doing the sort of anxious behavior and went back to sort of happy, playful life. So if their suffering wasn't similar, we wouldn't think that the same sorts of responses and medications would work if, in fact, they didn't suffer in a similar way. So then we get on to a whole second kind of category, which is simply the idea of the fall, that God created the world without animal suffering, and it came in as a result of human action. And so you'll see this quite regularly represented in the tradition of theological thought, particularly around the Reformation. This really comes to the fore. So you have somebody like John Calvin: all created things in themselves blameless, both on earth and in the visible heaven, undergo punishment for our sins. It has not happened through their own fault that they are liable to corruption. There's some deformity of the world which proceeds rather from the sin of man than from the hand of God. And he goes on, for it appears that all the evils of present life, which experience proves to be innumerable, have proceeded from the same fountain. The inclemency of the air, like we're having up here in Scotland today, frost, thunders, unseasonable rains, drought, hail, and whatever is disorderly in the world are the fruits of sin. Nor is there any other primary cause of diseases. So he's quite clear that he thinks that it is because humans have sinned that the world has gone astray. But that leads us into certain chronological problems, right? So we have about 3.5 billion years of life on Earth at a conservative estimate. We have 200,000 years of modern hominids, and about 350 million years of complex human life. And we only have about 50,000 years for behaviorally modern humans. So that chronology makes it rather difficult to kind of look back and say, well, humans were really at the root of it. We came too late in the story. So if we're saying that human agency of sin only came late in the story, for those who lived before the long history of the earth was apparent, that was an okay answer. There's only one really serious attempt that I'm aware of to try and say, yeah, humans are still the problem, even though the suffering happened before they were around. And that comes from William Dembski, who thinks that the effects of the fall were available, like were instituted in creation because God foreknew that the fall would happen. So he sort of says the effects of the fall were retroactively applied on early creation. But most won't do that, so they look for another agent who might have been around for a lot longer. So this is the sort of idea of satanic agency. And so in this way, you can deal with that chronological problem because you think, well, the fall of Satan or of the angels was probably pre-mundane. It happened before history and time on this earth was around. And so you can begin to see that that there could have been an agent. That agent could have been sinful and have caused evolution to take a whole form of competitive, full of death, full of extinction, full of disease, that God had never intended it to take. There are, of course, a few scriptural issues with this. The Bible is constantly saying, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. When God creates the world, including animals and humans, the chorus of creation in Genesis 1 is, it is good, 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 it is very good. And you'd sort of think, if there had been this tremendous fall, if the whole thing had been corrupted, that would have been a prime place where God could have pointed out that there was some problems in the process, and it's simply not there in the text, at least not very clearly or very evidently. Although others, colleagues, including my colleague Michael Lloyd at Oxford, would disagree with me on that, and we'd go back and forth. So a third option, if you're not going to say it's Satan, is to simply say that it is a mysterious element to creation, that there's some kind of falling away of creation from God's purposes. And this is done in various ways. Cecilia Dean Drummond would say something like, there's a shadow Sophia. There's a sense in which when you have a bright light, it creates the possibilities of darkness. You have Neil Messer, who uses Barth's idea of das Nichtige, of nothingness, that evil is what God did not will in creation, paradoxically giving it existence by not willing it. Nicola Hogard-Cregan pulls on the idea, the parable of the wheat and the tares, that the evil and the good in the world are tied up together, bound together in evolutionary processes, and they simply can't be separated until the new creation. And so each of these kind of say, there's a fallenness in creation, but we're not going to say it's due to humans. We're not going to say it's due to angelic elements of the creation. But one of the challenges to these views don't only come from the scriptures in the way that I had articulated earlier, but they also come from the science itself. And it's probably most poetically put by Holmes Roulston III. And he says this, he says, "The cougar's fang has carved the flanks of the fleet-footed deer." What he means by that is that deer, who we value because they're agile and they're swift and they can jump and they run and they're beautiful and they have these wonderful reflexes and senses, are those things precisely because they've been chased by predators for millions and millions of years. So the question is, if you didn't have the cougar, you also wouldn't have the deer, and you wouldn't have those agile elements, nor indeed would you have the power and swiftness of the cougar itself. So if you say that the cougar's fang, these sort of nature red and tooth and claw elements, the parts that make us go yuck, are due to Satan or due to some fallenness, then you have to attribute the skills and the beauties that come out of the existence of those more difficult sides also to the same source, because they're a direct result of that. And so what can happen is you end up saying, not only are the difficult and dark parts of creation due to Satan, but even the things that we value, the things that we admire, the beauty and skills of creatures become Satan's work as well, or indeed the work of fallenness. And so it's because of that hesitation that a number of scholars, including myself, would put ourselves to try and tackle this question in a way that we would say is without a fall. Now, what do I mean by without a fall? And here I'm not talking about, again, whether humans are sinful. Most of the theologians would admit that there is certainly a problem with humans in the world, and that there is some sort of human sinfulness, even if they might not use the non-biblical term of fall. But when we talk about fallenness in nature, there's really two different ways we could think of it. So I want to give you two sort of pictures. The first one is this, after all of our time with COVID, a very familiar sort of idea. But the idea is that fallenness is kind of like a virus, that what it is it's one thing that emits from a single center, a single cell even, and begins to go out through other creatures, begins to I'm forgetting the word here. That's terrible. It's getting to that point in the evening. It makes all the creatures sick. It gets into different bodies. It spreads throughout creation. And suddenly you have this diseased creation because things have grown out of one dysfunction. Infect was the word I was looking for. It infects all of creation with sinfulness. And so that's the way that I think the theological tradition often looks at the fall, that human sin infected creation, and then that creation became infected as a whole. And so suddenly lions started looking at lambs for the first time and going, that might be tasty. Whereas a different way to think about fallenness in the world is a little bit more orchestral. So I had mentioned to Thea before this that I'll have to leave right on time to get off to an orchestra practice. But if you think about the way the orchestra is situated, you've got all these different sections in it, and they're all working together to provide one unified sort of sound, one unified project of music. But what would happen if one part of the orchestra simply went rogue? If the trumpets just decided, you know what, we're going to do our own thing. we're going to, one starts playing God Save the King, another one starts doing a hymn, a third one just emits cacophonous sounds. Even if every other player was doing the right thing, every other instrument was in perfect tune, you would have total chaos. You would end up with a ruined performance. And so the second view of fallenness in the world is a little bit more like this, where it's saying most of creation, even though it has elements like death and suffering in it, are still actually doing the right thing. Some of those notes might be minor notes, but they're not basically opposed to the will of God. It's only when humans are that section that goes rogue that the whole performance suffers. And so you can say with Paul that all creation is groaning, but not because all creation has gone wrong, but simply because the human effects on creation cause a sort of fallenness that destroys the performance of creation. So those of us who look at the ideas of how do we justify God in light of the suffering that does happen in creation have three sorts of approaches. So the first is what I'll call just a package deal. And this is, you can't have some of the goods you value without some of the harms that lead directly to the goods. So we saw an example of that with the deer's agileness coming from the cougar's fangs. Another good example is simply our pain systems. So if we live in the world and we're soft-bodied creatures running around, we need things that tell us, hey, that's going to be harmful to you. And so mobile animals have largely been the greatest developers of nervous systems that give us awareness of immediate harms in our environment, precisely because we can do something about it. Now, we might sort of think that there's too much pain in the world, but when we actually look at what a life looks like when pain isn't a possibility, it's not a nice picture. So you have people who are born without the ability to feel pain, and they generally don't live beyond a couple of years because they just don't know to take their hand off the stove, or they'll run headlong into a wall over and over again because it doesn't hurt. Nothing is giving them that essential warning system that they need to stop. A similar example comes from people who have Hansen's disease, what was once known as leprosy, which is simply a bacterial infection of the pain nerves. And so the pain nerves die, and all the subsequent damage, the reason it was thought to be a flesh-eating disease, had nothing to do with the actual infection. It had to do with the people putting their hands in the fire and not knowing. By walking on broken feet and not knowing not to walk on it because they don't get those essential pain signals. In one African clinic, there was a problem with people with rats coming at night and chewing on patients' fingers, and they didn't feel pain, and so they didn't wake up and they couldn't protect themselves. So there's a whole bunch of ways where those things that we'd sometimes rather live without, like pain, actually turn out to be essential elements of the good life we want to live. A second example of a way that this is sort of thought about is free process. And so you see this particularly in John Polkinghorne, but it's adopted by others. And this is the idea that not everything in creation is designed to be exactly the way that it is. So when we say, well, why is there so much predation? Why are there so many diseases? Why are there so many aggressive viruses? It's saying, well, actually, God didn't micromanage creation. God gave the processes of evolution the ability to make itself. And so over time, you have an accumulation, a long, long history of choices that get passed on through species and through evolutionary pressures that form the way that creatures can live in the world. So you end up with obligate carnivores who can only live by taking other creatures' lives. And these are part of God's actual gift to creation, that sort of freedom to let creatures be themselves. And so we could look at something like this. This is a yellow-billed pintail from the Georgia islands near Antarctica, and they're renowned for being the only meat-eating duck. So if they find a seal carcass that's washed up on the beach, they will wander over and just stick their whole head in and start pulling out raw meat in a way that we would normally associate with vultures or eagles or sort of birds of prey. But, this didn't happen because, a duck got extremely aggressive one day. It was more likely that a duck was extremely hungry in a very challenging environment and thought, I guess I'll try that. And so there's this sort of sense of the openness of creation to creaturely choice, which then turns into species living in a particular way in the world. And so that's God's gift of freedom to the natural world. And so rather than sort of having defined corridors down which creatures must have to go, you have this sort of open playing field of possibilities through which creatures making decisions affect evolutionary history in large ways. And of course we do, looking at this sheep, we sort of think, there's the peaceful part of creation, but it's only peaceful if you're only worried about literal bloodshed. I mean, from the point of view of the grass, that sheep is a destroyer of worlds, right? So there's death all the way through the living systems that we live around. And while we tend to concentrate on the creatures that are most like us, it actually works all the way down and through. And finally, you get to the idea of a cross-centered creation. And you see this articulated well in Holmes Roulston, Lorna Wilkinson, Robert Farrar Capon. And the idea here is that the whole of nature is actually cruciform, that there's something of the shape of the story of the innocent death, the suffering of Jesus, his death, and then the resurrection to new life in the whole of the created order. And so what we're seeing in the cross is the story of nature. Or to put it the other way, what we're seeing in nature is actually the story of the cross. That the cross doesn't tell us something new about God. It tells us that always, 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 innocent suffering, innocent death will result as new life. And so that's what Holmes Roulston means when he talks about the cruciformity of creation. Lauren Wilkinson says this: there is unanswerable death and pain at every link in the great chain of life. And Christians must learn to see that the suffering is to be exchanged and borne, and that the central figure in that exchange is Christ, the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. So you have that sort of that enigmatic statement that Christ is the Lamb slain before the creation of the world. And so this isn't because of the fallenness of creation, but rather that there's a price of exchange to life. And that's been articulated in a number of different ways. Moltmann has this idea of Tzimtzum, where there's a sort of that he borrows from the Jewish tradition, where he's saying that even God had to sort of make room. God had to withdraw in order to fill creation. And so there's always this price to new creation. And if we didn't have death, if we don't have suffering, if we don't have pain, then we start to lose things like new life. We lose joy. We lose the ability to love, because those things are intrinsically tied together in this exchange. And of course, a good theodicist really can't talk about suffering and death without also talking about redemption. And I think that is a really good way to sort of draw together at least 8 of our 9 perspectives. The idea that the new creation is where part of the questions that we have about suffering and death are answered. That this is not the end of the story, but there will be resurrection, not only for humans, but actually for all living creatures, or others might say all living creatures that have suffered in a morally significant way. So that's really, so while everybody does look to redemption and to the eschatological new creation as the place where God will finally answer the sorts of questions we have, there is disagreement in the literature and amongst my colleagues around kind of who makes it, if I can put it that way. The idea that um, the is the new creation meant as something that is compensation, so that only creatures who have suffered are allowed in? Or is it more like C.S. Lewis said, where those creatures who have a personal relationship with humans are sort of brought into the human household and humanized by that and thus are included? So your dog might be there, but there probably won't be many dinosaurs. Or is it, as I would say, that all life is included, where the answer to what is redeemed is simply the same question as you would answer, what does God love? Because creation, in my sense, is theocentric. Whatever God loves will be there, because it wouldn't be heaven without all that God loves in it, or the new creation, if you will. And that is not a type of thinking that only began once people started thinking about evolution and started thinking about the long history. So we could go all the way back to someone like John Wesley. And this is what he says: the whole brute creation will then undoubtedly, I love that, undoubtedly, there's no question about this, be restored, not only to the vigor, strength, and swiftness which they had at their creation, but to a far higher degree of each than they ever enjoyed. They will be restored not only to that measure of understanding which they had in paradise, but to a degree of it much higher than that. It's interesting because his worry was not, do non-human animals have souls or anything like that. He was most worried that they might not be able to enjoy the new creation sufficiently without a higher level of consciousness. So he insisted that their mental capacities would increase in the new creation so that they could properly enjoy it. It is this: as a recompense for what they once suffered while under the bondage of corruption, they shall enjoy happiness suited to their state, without alloy, without interruption, and without end. And so that is a very quick, really whistle-stop tour showing you the sort of spectrum of Christian and indeed a few non-Christian approaches to this problem. Now, the reason I didn't break it down by sort of the denomination or the type of Christianity represented is because when I did that, it's a complete mess. You have people from all these different traditions holding all these different positions in various ways. And so it just wasn't a helpful way to do it. So I did go person by person and thematically in breaking it down, because there's just not strong sort of denominational approaches to most of these things. We have a few bits of further reading if you are interested, ways that you can look a little bit deeper in this. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bethany. That's a very comprehensive cover of a very complex issue from lots of different perspectives. So we now have time for questions for a couple of things that you mentioned in the course of your talk. One thing which struck me in the idea that is held by some theologians that there was some kind of pre-human fall in some angelic realm, and that affected the creation that humans now exist within. And I wondered how that would be consistent with the idea that we get in the book of Job, where Job himself, Satan there complains to God that you put a hedge around Job, so I can't do my worst to him. So it seems to me that there was at least even at that early stage the idea that God could have made a creation that was protected from the evil influences. So how does that fit into that theological picture?
That's really interesting. I'm glad that you brought up the Book of Job because it's fascinating on a number of levels. First, as you say, you have Satan as a central figure in the prologue, but of course he's up in heaven. He's part of the heavenly court. This isn't this sort of oppositional figure who's been banned and thrown down to the earth or thrown down to hell. So it's not our traditional Satan. And then, yeah, you do have him protecting Job, at least in various parts. Well, other parts, possibly parts he would have cared more about, like his children's life and, his livelihood were being taken away. But yeah, you see God exerting a sort of a coercive protective power, if I can put it that way, over the world in a different way. So that hasn't been addressed, as far as I know, by the sorts of people who look at that. But the other reason that I think Job is a really interesting question is that when Job offers his challenge to God, kind of says, if I could approach him, I would address him like a prince, like I'm the prince demanding to know why this has happened to me. And when God shows up, God kind of points out all the most problematic parts of creation as points of special interest and pride. So you go, have you seen the Leviathan? Have you seen, the storehouses of blizzards that I keep, where I keep all the hail? So the raven who is feeding their young with blood. There's all these points to this difficult part of creation where God is claiming it as God's own, rather than sort of saying, oh, well, I never really intended any of this. The one person that I think who really addresses the figure of Satan in the Theodicy literature is Eleanor Stump. So in her book, Wandering in Darkness, she proposes the idea that, in fact, the reason God goes through the wager, the reason God says, okay, yeah, you test Job as harshly as you want, is because God is trying to woo Satan back into deeper relationship with God. And so, so Job is having a journey of faith on one part, seeing God in a new way through all of this, but also God is attempting to restore relationship with Job. Now, I don't know if that's a stretch of the text, but I think it's a really interesting way to try and reapproach that very difficult text in a new way.
Okay, thank you.
Nina has just put one in the chat saying, could I elaborate on the idea of morally relevant versus non-relevant suffering? Where is the dividing line between these?
Okay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think that there's a few different ways we could approach this. One, we could ask sort of what is suffering versus what is pain. So, if you're going to say all suffering is morally relevant, I said at the beginning that the caterpillars probably aren't feeling that kind of suffering at all. So in pain studies, you generally have sort of 3 different degrees. You have nociception, which is the body's ability to give a pain signal. So this happens if you've ever touched a stove and pulled away before you even had a chance to be aware that you touched the stove. That's nociception at work, where it's simply a reflex arc between your muscles, your nerves, and some part of your central nervous system, like your spinal cord. Then you have sort of consciously aware pain. So that's when you have enough of a mind that you have a sense of me, you have a sense of prolonging this through time, you can have memories, and you can have behavior that's changed by pain that you have. And that simply means that you're aware that your pain nerves have been stimulated. But you can have pain without having suffering. So that's, for example, what morphine does. Morphine sort of cuts off the parts of the brain that make pain hurt. So people will be aware that something painful is happening to them, but it just doesn't hurt. And a lot of the there was a time in the early 20th century where they were trying to treat chronic pain by giving people lobotomies. Basically, they'd go up and scramble the frontal lobes of the brain, and it did actually work. People would be like, "Oh yeah, I'm in wretched, terrible pain," but it didn't hurt. And so we know that there can be a division between knowing you're in pain and it actually hurting. And so suffering becomes that level above pain where you feel the hurt. And of course, the complexity of that is you can have that without the pain nerves. So you can have phantom limb pain. People who've lost, an arm can say, my finger really hurts. And it's terrible because there's nothing they can do about it because that's entirely happening without the pain nerve actually firing. We could think of emotional pain. It can cause tremendous suffering, often worse than things you'd feel physically. Or if you had the choice, you'd take the physical over the emotional suffering. But there's no pain nerves firing in the body. There's nothing in your immediate vicinity that is doing your body damage, and so you can have suffering without pain. So one of the ways the literature tries to divide it is to say is suffering happening rather than just pain or nociception, and saying, well, that's the area we're talking about. Then once you do have suffering, then it starts to divide along a different set of axes where you're saying, okay, there's a kind of good suffering that an athlete feels, right? They go running up a mountain, and there's that sort of good pain of the lactic acid building up in their muscles, and there's a soreness the next day as they, revel in what they achieved. And so there's suffering there of a type, but it's self-chosen. The suffering that's usually is seen as something that might challenge God's goodness is the non-voluntary suffering. So suffering from disease where we can't actually cure it. So end-stage cancer pain is a good example of that, where the pain actually isn't serving any protective function at this point. It just hurts. In the animal kingdom, the classic example comes from William Rowe, who talks about, imagine if there was a fawn that got caught in a forest fire and it didn't quite die from the forest fire, but ended up, sort of collapsed in pain for several days after the forest fire passed, and it simply had burns and had, chest issues and wasn't, if you or I saw that deer, we would put it out of its pain. And so the fact that God doesn't seems to be an argument against God's goodness or even God's existence. So that's typically what people mean. And the other sort of words that will get thrown in there is gratuitous or non-gratuitous. So they would, people like Chris Southgate or Paul Fiddes would say, of course there's a great deal of non-gratuitous pain we need in the evolutionary process to protect us as individuals, and that are good for creatures to go through, even if they're hard. But it's that next level of pain that seems to have no particular reason about it, that happens because of accident or happens because of genetic problems that cause a lot of pain, but they don't actually serve any good. So that's at least how it's played out. Whether you can actually find examples or where to draw that line is a matter of much debate. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. I'm going to try to wind things up now, first of all, by just thanking you for covering such a range of topics. I was struck also by your suggestion that perhaps some of this problem that we have with animal suffering is from our human perspective, relating to the idea of things that we are not able to know, that are mysterious, but also that we see things from a human perspective. when the criticism is made of evolution as being wasteful, we think of waste as a moral, in terms of moral virtue, but only if resources are limited. But if God is infinite resource, then there's no such thing as waste. Just an idea that changing perspective can give us a different view on things. But thank you for raising so many of these interesting questions, and I wish we could go on all night and explore more of them. But I want to thank you, first of all, Bethany, for a really stimulating talk, and thank all our participants as well for your interest and your questions, and not forgetting Thea, who organizes this whole show. Thank you very much, Thea, and we're very grateful to all that you do in the background here. So once again, God bless you all, and perhaps see you again. God bless. Bye. Oxford, Bethany.
I'm off. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.